We are in our 6th week of going through the book of Revelation. Revelation's the last book in the New Testament, last book in the entire Bible. And it's this book that people either tend to kind of obsess about or avoid because it's scary and it's filled with all these kind of weird, bizarre images. And so we're just kind of making our way through Revelation, trying to understand, what is this all about? And Revelation, I've said this every week because I want to remind us of this because this is important. Revelation is a letter. It's a letter written from this guy, John, to 7 churches that are located in what we know as Turkey, but a lot of times in the ancient world was referred to as like Asia Minor. And so here's kind of a map that just shows you these churches are all fairly close together. And they're all a part of this kind of like big route in the ancient world. And all these cities are pretty big cities. And at this time, it's estimated that there's really only probably about 7,500 Christians in the entire Roman Empire, which the population was roughly like 50 or 60 million, I think. And so Christianity makes up a very small percentage. They are this very, very small movement that for these 7 churches exists in the heart of the Roman Empire. These are cities that are filled with Roman power, with Roman wealth, with Roman politics, with all of that stuff. And you have these small, powerless churches. Christians at this time were not wealthy, they were not influential. In fact, they were kept out of a lot of trade unions because they refused to participate in Roman civil religion. And so they are this kind of like ostracized minority. So these 7 churches that John writes to exist in this first century Roman Empire under Emperor Domitian, who was the emperor at the time. And John is writing this letter to them to help them figure out, how do we live as a church in the midst of this crazy situation in which we find ourselves? When Revelation's written toward the end of the first century, there's not active persecution against the churches, but it's always a threat. And for the first several hundred years of the church's existence, official Roman persecution will kind of come and go. And so Revelation is this letter that's written to these churches to encourage them. And the heart behind Revelation is, hey, you will prevail. Eventually Rome will fall. I know Rome looks all powerful and Rome looks like they're in charge, but Rome will fall. You will prevail. Hold on, endure, keep going. And the middle of Revelation that we're spending a couple weeks on, which is like chapters 6 through 16, this is where all this craziness kind of begins. And we said this last week, but Revelation 6 through 16, it's using this Old Testament concept called the Day of the Lord. The Day of the Lord was born out of this event called the Exodus, which was Moses leading the Hebrew people out of slavery, and there was all these plagues and everything. And so out of that in the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament, they'll talk about this idea of the Day of the Lord. And the Day of the Lord is really when justice comes for an evil empire. In the same way that Egypt was overcome in the Exodus, other, powers that are oppressing God's people will be overcome. So the Day of the Lord is used to talk about Babylon in the Old Testament. It's even used to talk about Israel because Israel becomes oppressive. And it's here being used to talk about Rome. That the Day of the Lord is coming for Rome. That Rome will fall, Rome will not prevail. And the Day of the Lord uses all this like kind of cosmic language and Exodus language rooted in the plagues. So it describes all these like fantastic things, but to talk about this historic reality that Rome will not end. That Rome will end. Rome will not be victorious. You will overcome. But leading up to that, there's going to be war and famine and disease and all of this suffering. But the day of the Lord is coming. Now, what we really want to look at this week, and we kind of hinted at this last week, is, okay, in the midst of all of this, what is exactly the job and the role of the church? Because what Revelation makes clear is that it's God who's going to overcome. It's God who's going to be victorious. But then what do these Christians and what do we as followers of Jesus now, what do we as a church now, how do we live in the midst of this reality in which we find ourselves? And the way that the middle part of Revelation works is it talks about the day of the Lord coming using these like 3 cycles of 7. And you'd have to look at it for it to totally make sense. But essentially, first, there's these 7 seals. Like these seals are being broken on a scroll, so you can open the scroll. And then the 7 seals lead to these 7 trumpets that are blown. And then after the trumpets, there's 7 bowls of wrath that are poured out. And so all of these 3 groups of 7 are all used to describe the same thing. It's not 21 different events. They're all used to kind of describe the day of the Lord that's coming for Rome, that Rome will fall. This is the part of Revelation that gets really, really scary. Because when you read it, you get all these weird, there's weird locusts that are eating things and devouring people, and people are dying left and right, and it gets crazy. And so we looked at all this. This is what we looked at last week. But what I want to focus on this week is in the midst of these 3 sevens, there's all of these interludes that just happened. Like John, as he's writing Revelation, he'll write about all this crazy stuff, and then all of a sudden the scene will shift. And these interludes, this is designed to break up the fear that Revelation might bring. That these interludes kind of pull us away from the unfolding action that's leading to the day of the Lord, that's leading to coming judgment for Rome. And it reminds us that, hey, as the people of God, we will be victorious. There's a New Testament scholar, his name is Scott McKnight, Dr. Scott McKnight, and here's what McKnight says about these interludes. He says, these interludes, they lift the listeners in the 7 churches out of the horrors of the dragon and the wild things and Babylon into the heavenly throne room to experience God as the real story behind the story of everything. And so again, if you were to go through and read Revelation 6 through 16, that's what you'll see. You'll see there's all this there's the trumpets, the bowls, the seals, all this craziness, and then randomly it'll just shift to a different scene, and you'll see something else. And what McKnight points out is the point of these little interludes that kind of break up the action of the middle part is to bring hope, is to give hope to these 7 churches that they will overcome and they will prevail. Now, McKnight, in his book on Revelation, he actually identifies 10 different interludes. You don't have to remember these. We're not going to go through all of these, but I'm just showing you. These are the interludes that he kind of lays out. And he says each one of these is designed to pull us out of the fear and the craziness and to give us hope. Now, some of these interludes require a bit more like discussion. Like next week, we're going to look at the dragon and the beasts because those are bigger themes throughout. Some are just little scenes that we see that we kind of move on, and Revelation never really comes back to them. But what I want to do is today is I kind of want to get an overview. What really are these interludes saying about the role of the church amidst kind of the unfolding of history? As history is moving forward, as the day of the Lord is coming, these give us snapshots of hope, but what are they actually telling us about what it means to be the people of God in the midst of all of this? So if you go back, the first of the 3 sevens are the seals, that Jesus is opening these seals to open up this scroll. And when he gets to the first seal, he opens the first seal, there's a voice, we're told. This voice comes and says, don't harm anything until a seal is put on the foreheads of God's people. So before any of this unfolding happens, we need to mark who are the people of God and who are not the people of God. And Revelation 7:4, here's what John writes in Revelation 7:4. He says, then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. Now, if you're familiar with Revelation at all, seals and marks are a big deal. First, here we'll see the people of God that are sealed. And next week, we're going to actually talk about there will be people that will receive a mark. It's referred to as the mark of the beast. But they're people that are marked. They're sealed. And really, the idea of sealing the people of God goes all the way back to the Old Testament. It's not a new idea that originates here in Revelation. If you go back, the Old Testament, Ezekiel talks about seals on the people of God. And Ezekiel exists during the post-exile period where God's people are returning home. And so let's mark who really are the people of God. Let's make sure we can distinguish who are God's people. And when you talk about seals and marks, the purpose of seals and marks is to define ownership. Who does one belong to? The reason Ezekiel wants to seal the people of God in the Old Testament is because we want to mark who are God's people. Who are the people that actually belong to God, that follow God, that obey God, that are part of what God is doing in the world. In the book of Ephesians, Paul will actually refer to the Holy Spirit, which is the presence of God, as a seal in the life of followers of Jesus. That when we are baptized and we place our life into Jesus, his presence comes and lives within us, and it's a seal, it's a marker. This is what shows, hey, we're the people of God because this presence, this spirit is this seal. It's this proof that I belong to God. When I was growing up, there was all this fear. I grew up within the church, and there was all this fear of what mark are you going to get? People used to say they're going to put microchips in you, and that's going to be the mark of the beast, and you're going to get a tattoo and a barcode. And we took this idea of seals and marks, and we brought fear to it. What does it really mean? Am I going to get it? But here's the thing in Revelation. Revelation never really defines what this seal is, or when you get to the mark next week, what the mark is. But here's the point. It's not about being tricked or being duped. It's about allegiance. It's about who are you allegiant to. And so it's not like, hey, I've been duped into getting this microchip or this barcode. It's about the way I live my life. Am I allegiant, in this case, to Jesus? Or am I allegiant to Rome? So we don't have to be afraid about, oh, am I going to get some mark that's going to mark me as for or against the people of God? That's not the point. That's not what John's getting at. John's just saying, hey, let's distinguish who we belong to. Everybody belongs to someone or something. So who do we belong to? So these people, these 144,000 are sealed because they're marked out of these are the people of God. Now, 144,000 is a multiple of 12. 12 is always the number of God's people, always. In the Old Testament, in Israel, there's 12 tribes. Jesus, when he shows up, recruits 12 apostles. So 12 is always the number of the people of God. And so when you see multiples of 12, it's kind of this way of exaggerating this full, complete picture of the people of God. And this, particularly the 144,000 in Revelation, seems to refer to just the people of God who are alive on earth at this point. Now we know there's not 144,000 actual Christians on the planet at that time, but the image is designed to encourage the Christians in these 7 cities because it's reminding them, you're bigger than you think you are. You're more powerful than you think you are. You may feel like the small, powerless minority, but you are the sealed people of God with the power and the presence of Jesus living inside of you. You are the full and complete people of God. That's who you are. That's who you belong to. So then John hears this, hey, there's 144,000 of these people, but then he turns and looks, and when he looks, he sees a much larger crowd. And here's what Revelation 7, 9 through 10 says. John says, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. Jesus is the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. So John is first told, hey, there's this group that has been sealed. These are the people of God. These are the people who are allegiant to God. They're not allegiant to Rome or the Roman way or the Roman system. These are people that are allegiant to God. These are the people on earth that belong to Jesus. These are people of the Lamb. John then turns and he sees a crowd that's way bigger than that. And this now seems to refer to not just the people who are alive, but even the people who are dead, who are long gone. This great crowd of people who now represent the totality of the faithful people of God. Those who are alive, those who've gone before. In Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews refers to it as this great cloud of witnesses. This people who are the faithful people of God. And they're wearing white robes and they're holding palm branches. Palm branches are a symbol of victory. These people have been washed. Keep in mind, some of these people have been killed. Some of these people have been martyred. Some of these people have suffered greatly. But now they're standing on the other side victorious. And they have these palm branches. They're waving these palm branches. They're singing out to Jesus. They're worshiping. They're praising. Salvation, victory belongs to God and to the Lamb, to Jesus. Through his death and resurrection, he has overcome. And this multitude is made up of every tribe and language and tongue. It's this diverse group of people, all before God. Revelation 7:14, if you go on a few verses later, it says this. It says, these are those who've come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white, here's the key, in the blood of the Lamb. Revelation always brings victory back to the death and resurrection of Jesus. Always. See, part of the reason Revelation scares us is because it uses all this war language and it looks kind of to the future, and we tend to look to the future like, hey, the victory is coming through this great thing in the future. But what Revelation always does when it talks about victory is it always takes us back to the death of Jesus. This is where victory comes from. Why are these faithful people of God who've come through this tribulation, who've come through this suffering, this persecution, this martyrdom in some cases, why are they victorious? Why have their robes been washed? Why are they waving these victorious palm branches? Because of Jesus. Not because of anything they have done. Not because they fought and they overcame Egypt or Babylon or whoever the enemy was during their lifetime, but because of what God has done through Jesus, because of his death, because of his blood, because of his resurrection. And so the message to these churches and to us is that even in the midst of all of this suffering, God is saving his people. He has saved his people in the past. His people in the past. The people that were faithful to him, that were allegiant to him, that suffered under Egypt or Babylon or Assyria or the Seleucid Empire, or whatever. You pick the time in history. These people that suffered under all of these different leaders and regimes and all this stuff, they have overcome. God has been faithful. Look, they are now victorious. And in the same way that God has saved his people in the past, he will save his people again. Doesn't mean we won't go through some of the same things they went through. But ultimately, we will stand victorious at the end. God will vindicate his people. You will be proven right, and you will join this great multitude from every tribe, tongue, and nation, worshiping the Lamb, because that's where our victory comes from. So again, this is kind of the heart of what these interludes are all about. They're meant to pull us out of the chaos of all this suffering that's happening as the story of Revelation is moving on, and to remind us of, hey, there's victory. There's going to be victory. As the faithful people of God, you will be victorious. You will triumph. One of the most famous interludes in Revelation, this is the other one I want to look at, involves these two witnesses. And again, in the midst of the unfolding drama and revelation of these, seven seals and trumpets and bowls and all the chaos, we're told specifically about these two witnesses. And as a kid, I was always kind of taught that hey, these were two actual people that were going to show up, and this is what happens here describes what is really going to happen, and it was this literal description. But what's fascinating when you go back and read it, the description of these two witnesses is filled with Old Testament language, filled with all these quotes of the Old Testament. And when you look at it in the context in which John writes it, you come to understand that these witnesses are really, it's meant to inspire us as the church, for here's how we are to live. And I want to read it. You can follow along on the screen. I'm going to condense a little bit of it, but I want to read to you this interlude about these witnesses. So I'm going to read kind of a big chunk of it, and then we'll go back and unpack it and talk about what John's really saying here. So Revelation 11, verse 1 is where this interlude comes from. And John writes, he says, I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and I was told, go and measure the temple of God and the altar with its worshipers. And you skip ahead and it says, I will appoint my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. They have power to shut up the heavens so that it will not rain during the time they are prophesying, and they have the power to turn the waters into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they want. Now, when they have finished their testimony, the beast comes up from the abyss and will attack them and overpower them and kill them. Their bodies will lie in the public square of the great city. The inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and will celebrate. But after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet. And terror struck those who saw them. Then they heard in a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. And they went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies looked on. And so let's talk about what is John actually getting at here? What is he actually saying? John starts off by saying, hey, let's measure the temple, and let's measure the temple and its worshipers. This is an idea that goes again back to the Old Testament. I believe it's Ezekiel and Zechariah, these prophets, that they measure the temple. And the reason they're measuring the temple is not because they're curious about the dimensions of the temple. It's because they're marking off, this is the space where God lives. That's how people understood the temple language and temple theology, that the temple was essentially the palace of a god or goddess, and this is where they lived, this is where they dwelt. So they're measuring the temple to mark off, this is where God lives. Now, what they add to it this time is, notice, they're told, hey, measure the temple, but measure the worshipers too. Not just the physical space, but the people. Because what Jesus makes clear is that the old temple system is gone, it's obsolete. And in fact, when Revelation's written, the temple's actually destroyed. The temple gets destroyed 10 to 20 years before Revelation is written. So there is no actual physical temple. What Jesus says is that you, as the people of God, you become the living temples. Paul unpacks this idea that because God's Spirit lives with us, we are the temples. God is within us. The people of God is where God lives. And so really what this whole story is about, that John makes clear from the beginning, is this is about God among his people. It's about God dwelling with his people and what God is doing in his people during this whole time. So we measure the temple. We mark, this is where God lives. He lives among his people, within his people. And then we're introduced to these two witnesses. And these two witnesses, then they spend 42 months going around kind of giving their testimony. 42 months represents 3.5 years, which is half of the number 7. Half of the number 7 is a hugely symbolic number in all throughout Scripture. 7 is like the number of perfection. It's the number of God. And so 3.5 represents a broken 7. Actually, if you go back to the book of Daniel, 3.5 represents a time of persecution for the people of God. 3.5 is this time that the people of God will be persecuted. And so you have these two witnesses that are giving their testimony, right? They are bearing witness during this time of persecution. Now, next, we're told the power that is given to these two witnesses. And the power that's given to them, this is what lets us know who these two witnesses are, because it represents two really important people in the history of the people of God. The witnesses are able to stop rain, and they're able to bring all kinds of plagues on the earth, including turning water to blood. Okay, if you are someone who is at all familiar with the story of the people of God, going back into the Old Testament, going back into Israel, then there's one guy who stops the rain, and his name is Elijah. Elijah gets in huge trouble with the leadership in his day because he stops the rain and it leads to famine and all this messed up stuff. So this is about Elijah. And then when it comes to plagues, and specifically plagues of turning water into blood, this is Moses. So you have these images of Moses and Elijah, which, interestingly enough, there's this really cool story from Jesus' life where he takes a couple of his followers up on this mountain, and they have this event that's described as the Transfiguration. And he just goes up on this mountain, and it's all crazy, and there's light shining everywhere, and there's two people that appear with Jesus. It's Elijah and it's Moses. And Jesus' two followers that are there are like, oh my gosh, this is incredible, this is amazing. And so these two people, Elijah and Moses, these are like the giants of the people of God. When it comes to faithfulness, these are the two that are like at the top of the list. Historically, these are the people that have been most faithful to God. These are the people that have overcome so much. These are the people that faced overwhelming opposition in their lives. But they were able to overcome, they were able to triumph. These are the heroes of the people of God. And so John gives these as examples. Hey, the same God that was with Moses, the same God that was with Elijah, lives in you. These are the examples of what we're to be like. Not that we have to do all these crazy things, but here's these faithful people of God in the past who stood against incredible odds and they overcame and they were victorious. Here's these examples that we look to. But then, in the story of the two witnesses in Revelation, they're killed. They're killed by this beast. We'll get to the beast next week, and the beast is kind of this epitome of evil, essentially. They're killed, and when they're killed, what happens? The world rejoices. These idiots are dead. They're gone. We don't have to listen to them anymore. We don't have to hear them anymore. And they're gone for, what? 3.5 days. It's another broken 7. And then God resurrects them. He brings life into them. Now, understand, this whole thing about the witnesses being killed, this wasn't to try to scare the 7 churches. These 7 churches in Revelation knew that they could be killed at any moment. So the idea that God's faithful people would be killed, that may scare people like you and I, who've lived our whole life in a place that has religious freedom and we're supposed to be free from persecution. But for these 7 churches, it's like, oh yeah, that's part of what happens sometimes. Sometimes you suffer. Sometimes you get thrown in jail. Sometimes you get killed. John, even in the beginning of Revelation, addresses one church and says, hey, I know you've got at least one martyr. So he's not trying to scare them. He's just naming a reality that everyone is very well aware of, that this might happen. But then in the end, it's God who breathes life back into these 2 killed witnesses, these 2 murdered witnesses, and they're resurrected, and God calls them up. Come to me, share in my kingdom, like let's be triumphant. And so in the end, these faithful witnesses, they're vindicated. They're proved right. They triumph and they overcome. See, this is the theme of all of these interludes. If you look at these interludes, These interludes are, hey, amongst all of this chaos, amongst all of this suffering, amongst all the wars, disease, and famine, all this stuff that's happening, we're given these pictures of the triumphant people of God. That God will vindicate you. Yeah, you may suffer and you may go through things, and it may even lead to martyrdom in some cases, but in the end, you will be triumphant. The faithful people of God will be victorious because God will be victorious through the victory of the slain lamb, and we will share in his victory. And as you look at these interludes and as they talk about the people of God and what the people of God are doing during all this time, we've looked at 2 of these interludes, but you can go back and look at all of them. Really, the faithful people of God, their job, their role, what Revelation describes them doing during this whole time is really 2 things. And here they are: worship and witness. Remember the first interlude, what happens? You have the 144,000 and they're joined by all the faithful people of God. And what are they doing? They're standing before the Lamb and they're singing, "Salvation belongs to our God." You'll see a lot of these interludes revolve around this idea of worship, of let's give honor to God because God is the creator and God is the sustainer and God through the Lamb is the victorious one. And then again, if you go on to the witnesses, theirs is about, that's exactly the word that Revelation used, it's about witness. That during the unfolding of history, these are the tasks of the church. The church is to be these people who live lives that are lives of worship, that are lives of witness. Now, what's interesting is currently in kind of the way we think about church, we tend to think of these things as programs. And like, this is what churches do. We get together and we worship, and typically we define worship as let's sing a few songs. And then witness is about, hey, here's how I'm going to share Jesus with you. And throughout my lifetime, there's been all kinds of methods of here's how we share Jesus. Here's a tract that you can look at, those little pamphlets that people give you that if you've ever been given one, my guess is you probably never read it. Or there was, even when I was a kid, there was like a door-to-door thing where you would knock on people's door and say, hey, if you died tonight, do you know if you'd go to heaven or hell? That we've made it programmatic. And I'm not saying all those things came from bad intentions. I think they came from good intentions, but that's how we understand it. That these are programs, these are things the church does. But when you look in Revelation, and when you look really throughout the rest of the New Testament, what these actually are is these are embodied lifestyles. These are the way the church lives. This is how the church operates within the world in which they live. That worship is ultimately about submission. It's about humility. It's about honor and recognition. It's about submitting before God that you are God. It's about giving glory and honor to God. See, I think we miss this sometimes. Christian ethics, the way that we live our life, are rooted in worship. Why do we live our life the way that we do? Because it's what brings honor to God. Why do we behave the way they do? Because it's what brings honor to God. Paul will talk in the New Testament about how worship is this whole lifestyle. It's the way that we live. And it's rooted in recognition of who God is and bringing honor to God. See, we live with this like, oh, it's about pleasure, it's about enjoyment, it's about, no. Christian ethics are rooted in worship. What honors God with the way that I behave? What honors God with the way that I the way that I treat other people? This is how the church is to live, a life of embodied worship and a life of embodied witness. Christian, you know where that word comes from, the word Christian? In the book of Acts, in the city of Antioch, the people outside of the church look at the church and say, everything about those people is Christ. All they do is talk about Christ. Christ this and Christ that and Christ this and Christ that. They're Christians. Christians is actually a derogatory term. It means like little Christ. It would essentially be the same, you know how like Swifties is what you call like Taylor Swift fans. You get that's essentially really where Christian comes from. It's like a Jesus Swiftie is essentially really all you are. That's where it comes from. And what's so amazing about that is these people outside of the church looked at him and were able to identify, these people are about Jesus. Would people say that about you and I? Would they say that about us? Would they be able to look at our lives and say, dude, everything about these people, everything about that church centers on Jesus? See, that's witness. Yes, it is the words that we say. It's the way that we live. It's the totality of our entire life. It's not just a program. This is the job of the church. Worship and witness. So as history is kind of unfolding, and as there's chaos, and as there's all this stuff that's going on, there's war, famine, disease, suffering, as God is working to overcome evil through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the church exists to be a community of worship and a community of witness. And see, we are given Elijah and Moses as these examples of faithful people of God. But actually, if you go back to the beginning of Revelation, in Revelation 1:5, we're given the primary witness. Here's what Revelation 1:5 says. Yeah. From Jesus Christ, who is the faithful witness. See, Moses and Elijah, these are good examples, but Jesus is actually the ultimate witness. That the way we live is to be lived in the image of Jesus. New Testament will even talk about this is the power of the Spirit to transform us to live like Jesus. The dominant force in Jesus' day was the Roman Empire. And the real power of the Roman Empire was to conform you into its image. And what people wanted from Jesus is they wanted him to fight back. They wanted him to overthrow Rome. They wanted him to get violent and to pick up a sword and to just wipe Rome off the face of the planet and to establish a new kingdom. And that's exactly what Jesus refused over and over and over again. And they killed him for it. The dominant force in the world in which you and I live is American culture. And the power of American culture is the same power of Roman culture. It's the power to conform you into its image. Jesus responded to Roman culture by giving his life. That's how he responded to the power of Roman culture. I'm going to give my life. The way that Christians, by and large, have chosen to respond to the power of American culture is going back about 40 years or so, we started to fight culture wars. And this is language you hear all the time. Like culture wars, culture wars, culture wars. It happens all the time, and we fight them all over the place. And I'm not saying there's not worthy causes in there, but what's kind of frustrating to me is fighting culture wars is exactly what people wanted from Jesus, and it's exactly what he refused to do. He wouldn't fight back like that. I'm a big Star Wars fan. I don't know if you're a Star Wars fan. If you're not, that's okay. I still love you. You're still welcome here. But I'm a big Star Wars fan. I had finally watched the show Andor. Andor is a show on Disney Plus, and it's about the birth of the rebellion. How did the rebels begin against the Empire? And it's this really interesting. It's a really good show. Some of the other shows on Disney Plus are lame, but this one I actually really enjoyed it. And there's a scene in one of the episodes of Andor where you have these two guys that are talking about how much they've given up for the rebellion. What does it cost them? One guy is a spy that's deep in the Empire. The other guy is kind of the leader of the rebellion, and they're going back and forth on what has this cost you? What have you had to give up for the sake of the rebellion to try to overthrow the Empire? And what one of the guys said was phenomenal. This was his response, and he was super passionate about it. And he's saying, what have I had to give up? Here's what I've had to give up. Calm, kindness, kinship, love. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my eagerness to fight. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost. And by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. I am condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency. And when he said that, I just stopped. I literally paused it and I stopped. And I rewatched it and I thought, wow. I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. This is what people wanted from Jesus. They wanted him to use Roman tools to overthrow Rome and to defeat Rome. Because what are Roman tools? Violence, war, militancy. And he refused to do it. See, our cultural wars aren't necessarily fought with violence and war, but they're fought with money and with power and with media and propaganda and politics. They're fought with adversarial weapons. How do we attack other people and how do we bring other people down? Martin Luther King Jr., is widely regarded by everyone in the U.S. now, for the most part, as a hero. Did you know that just before Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, there was a national poll taken, and he had a 75% disapproval rating? 75% of people in this country did not like him. And it wasn't just people who opposed him. In fact, I read one of his last marches, it might have even been his last march. He was marching, and the people that were marching with him got so frustrated with him because he was so committed to nonviolence, he would not respond with violence, they got mad and started a riot. Because what they thought is it's not enough. What you're doing is not enough. It's not working. And they got tired. So it wasn't just people that were like against Martin Luther King Jr. It was people that were with him that just got frustrated with his methods. It's not working. It's not working. It's not working. And they got tired. And so literally the guy died. He was murdered. He was assassinated. And as far as he knew when he died, no one liked him. And he never really saw the fruits of any of his labor. Now he's a hero. But it took time. I mean, he's been vindicated since then. People look at, I think it was Billy Graham who looked back and said one of the biggest regrets of his life was he didn't march with Martin Luther King Jr. Because MLK was so controversial. And so here's a guy that literally died kind of like the enemy, public enemy number one. But since then, he's been vindicated. And he's overcome. I love this quote that MLK gave. He said, "Always be sure that you struggle with Christian methods and Christian weapons." See, this was his point. He said, as Christians, we fight differently. We fight. We're in a battle. We're in a war. But we do not use the tools of our enemy. We don't. We fight differently. Our enemies fight with adversarial weapons. Our enemies tear one another down. Our enemies destroy one another. Our enemies attack one another. And attacking doesn't just have to be physically. It can be verbally. It can be emotionally. We do it online all the stinking time. MLK's point was, as Christians, we don't do that. We fight differently. See, I think the reason that a lot of Christians engage in culture wars is the same reason people got frustrated with MLK, because the old ways don't work anymore. The way that Jesus resisted was rooted in service and sacrifice and giving his life. Well, that doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work. Okay, a couple things. First of all, and you're probably not going to like that I'm saying this, but I don't care. In the New Testament, no one ever said it would work. They said it was faithfulness. Jesus said this is faithfulness. He never said, hey, this is going to work. Hey, this is how everyone's going to like you. Hey, this is how you're going to build massive churches. No, it was never like, hey, this is going to work. No, this is faithfulness. Worship and witness in the way of the Lamb is faithfulness. When we embody the life that Jesus, when our worship and our witness reflects Jesus and his submission to his Father and his lifestyle of witness, of love and of service and of giving, no one ever said it's effective. It said it was faithfulness. And the church is ultimately judged for faithfulness, not effectiveness. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be effective. Jesus and Paul wanted to be effective. They worked to be effective. But it wasn't about effectiveness. It was about faithfulness. And secondly, for the record, it did work. Okay? Let me show you what victory actually looks like. Put up that last picture. I think they're getting there. Yeah, no, skip that. It's the last picture. It's the picture of the gate in Rome. Yes. This is what victory actually looks like. And let me explain to you what this is. This is a picture of the entrance, the emperor's entrance to the Roman Colosseum. So all around, there were all these different other entrances. Directly across from the emperor's entrance was the gladiator's entrance, where they would enter and kill each other. There was the public would enter from all these other entrances. But this is the emperor's entrance. This is where the emperor and the emperor alone would go into the Colosseum. In the 18th century, the Pope, I think it was Pope Benedict XIV, put a cross there. You know why he put a cross there? To commemorate all the Christian martyrs that died there. This is now the entrance that when you go to the Colosseum, every tourist walks into this entrance. So when tourists walk into the entrance of the Colosseum, where people were brutally killed in the Roman way, where Christians were brutally killed in the Roman way, when people walk in, you know what they see? Not Roman greatness, not Roman grandeur. They see the legacy and the testimony of those people who gave their life for Jesus Christ. And those people overcame the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is long gone. In fact, the Roman Empire ultimately became a Christian empire. But the faithful witness of the people of Jesus is what triumphs. You know what's sad? The culture wars, we started fighting those in the 70s and 80s. And you know what the culture wars were based on? They were based on things like marriage and sexuality and abortion. All of those things, culture warriors have lost. The one thing culture warriors might point to is like, oh, look, Roe versus Wade was overturned. Did you know that since Roe versus Wade has been overturned, the number of abortions performed in America has gone up? That's not victory. See, we fight these culture wars using the weapons of our enemy, and it's why we fail. The job of the church is to live in the way of Jesus, to live this life that is about witness and it's about worship. And we do that in the way of the Lamb. And the promise is, that's what brings victory. Maybe not on your timeline, maybe not the way that you want. You know how long it took the early Christians to overcome the Roman Empire? About 300 years. Longer than we've been a nation. But that's where victory comes. We share in the victory of Jesus when we live in the way of Jesus. A life of embodied worship and witness. That's our job. That's our task. That's what leads to victory. Let me pray. Father, I thank you for your love. I thank you for everything you've given to us. I thank you that you are the victorious one. You are the slain lamb that has overcome. And you are the example of what faithful witness looks like. That you triumphed. And Father, we share in that triumph when we live lives of worship and witness. And I know sometimes it gets frustrating, because sometimes when you live these lives of embodied worship and witness, you feel like, oh, it's not working, it's not effective. But God, effectiveness is ultimately about faithfulness. It's not about overcoming, it's not about conquering, because that's your job. That's what you do. We are your faithful people. We share in your victory. We share in your life. We share in your death and resurrection. And we do that by living lives that are faithful lives of worship and of witness. Lives that always and consistently point to you and who you are. God, we love you. We thank you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.